Hi, I'm Grant from Black Magic Design, and today I'd love to give you an update on what's new with Davinci Resolve 17. So the big question, I guess, is why did we develop the speed editor? Well, we didn't want to waste space on a QWERTY keyboard, which we really felt like is probably designed sort of as a modification of a normal keyboard for traditional editing. But we wanted to design a keyboard specifically for the cut page. We wanted something to work better with laptops. We also wanted something that worked with your regular QWERTY keyboard. If you really like that keyboard, you can keep using it because this works in conjunction with it. That's why it was Bluetooth. So obviously, as I mentioned before, it's Bluetooth and it's got an internal battery. Now the USB, if you look at the back there, the USB can be used to charge it, or you can use it with USB if you don't want to use the Bluetooth. But the reason we did Bluetooth is there's no cable, so it can sit in front of your normal keyboard, and that's really important. Now I've got an overhead camera, so if we cut to that, we can have a look at the regions on the keyboard and I can explain what's on here. Now all the transport controls are on the right-hand side here. There's a search dial on the right. That's a solid metal search dial with roller bearings. You got your shuttle, jog, and scroll buttons there. Now there's timeline and source tape selectors. You know, when you push the timeline, you're on the timeline. Push the source tape, you're back on the source tape, as we did before. Now you really use all this with your right hand. Your left-hand side is for your editing functions, and that is what you use with your left hand. So what it means is you're sort of editing with both hands. You know, you're kind of looking for shots here and you're working with your left hand. Now there's really large in and out buttons. And so the top, sorry, before I mention that, I forgot about the editing functions. The editing functions are up here. And this is where you do your smart insert, append, ripple, overwrite, close up, place on top, and source overwrite buttons. And you've got the big in and out buttons here. You can find them by feel. There's a slight gap in here so you can find them. And then there's a whole bunch of trimming modes, and that's an incredibly powerful feature of this. And then there's transition types. You can select between types of transitions. Now in the top middle is the general functions. There's a whole bunch of random, well not random, but different functions here. In the lower middle is the camera controls for the sync bin, which I'll get to. And then of course you've got the play and stop bar, which is very traditional for a keyboard. So let's see what it can do and really show how fast it can be. Now I've got a monitor just below the camera here, so it lets me actually use the speed editor here while I'm talking to you. And we'll use the overhead camera so you can sort of see what buttons I'm pushing. And it'll be a bit more uncluttered than if I try to use it in front of the computer. So we've set up a separate monitor here. Now what I'll do is I'll create a new project and I'll import the Winter Wonderland clips into that so we can do some edits and we'll show you how it works. So I'll just pop back here for a moment to do that. And I'll load in some shots. Oops, I can do that here. Oops, I've got my Winter Wonderland shots in there now. I'll also create a new timeline. So we've done that now, and let's create some edits with the speed editor keyboard. Now what we'll do is we'll select the source tape so we can see what shots we want to get, and we'll scroll along to see what we want to get. Now what we want to do is we want to select these shots and put them into the timeline. So we'll scroll around looking for nice shots. I'm just using the search dial. I'm using the scroll function. If I want to get really accurate, I can use jog. So let's get some of this shot there. That shot there looks good. Place an in point. I'll place an out point. This is a very fast way to find shots. And all I need to do is go and add in with the append button. So I've got one shot in my timeline, and now we'll go and do it to another. So let's have a look around. Now I don't need to do anything. I can just keep looking for shots. There's an interesting looking shot. I'll append that. So I've got two shots on the timeline. So you just go along here looking for different shots. Now we can resize the viewer. There's a resize viewer button on here. And so if I push and hold this button, I can resize the viewer. So I can do that with the search dial. Now because we're looking for source media, we'll actually make the viewer nice and big. Now using in and out points is quite slow, so we can do it without doing in and out points. Now you'll notice on the front of the smart insert and the pen buttons there's a word clip. Now a bunch of buttons on this keyboard have secondary functions, and in this case by selecting those I can insert the whole clip without needing to put in and out points. So let's clear the in and out points, and then we'll go along and we'll just put some clips in. So let's append a whole clip. Let's have a look for something. Let's find some of the feel. That looks pretty good, so let's put that in. That's the whole clip. And we'll look for another store. That looks pretty good. Append that. Just did an autosave. Let's see what else we've got. Scroll along, looking for something. Oh, that looks pretty good. I'll append that. I don't know why I got so many shots of food. That's probably a bad sign. So we've got a bunch of clips in the timeline. I just added those in just by pushing append. So you can see this is why it's so important we start on the source tape, because you can just roll along looking for clips and drop them into the timeline. Well, now let's do some trimming. So we'll go back to the timeline. We can scroll along here and see some of these clips. Now we want to trim off a little bit of some of these clips so we can trim out. There's the trim out button here. So if you hold the trim out button, you can then trim and it live trims. I can also trim in. I can go down. Now you'll see that little smart indicator, see that little arrow there just above the edit point. That edit point shows you where it's going to trim. So you don't even have to do any in and out points or anything. You just have to hold trim. If I hold trim out, I can just scroll that back. If I go trim in, it'll do the next clip. I can scroll along here and do trim out, trim in. I can even trim out at the end. So you don't have to select, it's very, very quick. You don't have to select any of the you don't need to select any in and out points or anything like that. So the great thing about that is that you can just, like, I think trimming is probably one of the most powerful functions of the keyboard and makes it so fast. So now we've done some trimming, let's go and add some dissolves. Now you can select transitions down the bottom here just by turning on and off. So normally you've got to drag and drop transitions, or you can do a keyboard shortcut. We have a button that allows you to turn on and off dissolves. So let's do that. So go to the front of the timeline. I can pretty much push a dissolve, scroll along, and add transitions. Now everything's got a nice dissolve. I can play and I've got my nice transition. And I can do additional trimming. Another thing I do is I can remove the dissolves just as quickly. So let's have a look at that. So if I roll along here, I can pretty much go along here and remove the dissolves just as fast. Now I can also change the default duration of a dissolve, or I can change the duration. So if I put a dissolve back in, I can go along here and I can go transition duration and I can change the length of it. So say if I want faster transitions that are 10 frames long, oops, there I am there. Now I can make that the default transition duration. So the way I do that is I double press, and that's because it's got a set key on the front. And if I double press the transition duration, now that'll be the default transition duration. So if I go along and create my transitions now, I missed one back there. Now they're all the same format, so I can change those anytime I like. Now some of the other rep modes is I can roll transitions and slip and clips. So let's have a look at that. So if I come down here, I can roll by pushing this roll button here. I can roll the transition up and down the timeline. I can also slip the clip. I can slip clips either side. I've got slip in, slip source. So I can slip the clip there, or I can slip the destination clip. I can also move a clip up and down the timeline, and that's very fast. So let's have a look, see how that works. So if I hold the move button, the clip will highlight and I can just drag it down and then release it. And now it's moved the clip up and down the timeline. I have a nice full screen button up here. If I want to play full screen, I can just go and push the full screen button and then play. I push escape to go out of that. Now if I'm working and I want to trim and edit, what I can do is I might want to review that last edit. So if I double push the full screen button, it'll now take me a couple of seconds before the edit point and then play through it. So it's a really fast way of reviewing an edit in full screen. And if I double press it again, it goes right back to the same spot. There's also a button to adjust the audio level of a clip. I've got the audio level button just here. So if I hold that, I can adjust the audio up and down. You can see it there as I adjust the search dial. You see the audio level going up and down on the clip. I can also add markers anywhere I want. If I double press, the word marker is in front of the audio level button. So if I double press it, now I get a marker. So I can add markers if I need to fix something later. I want to come back to it. And in fact, if I want to change the color of the marker, it'll put down the marker that's on the right-hand side of the user, on the left-hand side of the user interface, just on the left of the timeline, lower timeline ruler. If I want to change the marker color, I double press and hold. And it'll bring up a nice marker color window. So I can select a new marker color. I can scroll along. And now all the markers will be that color. There's also a snapping function, but snapping works a little bit different with the speed editor. When you're using snapping in the UI, it tends to be magnetic. It'll snap onto the edit point. With the speed editor, what it'll do is it'll pause as you scroll through the edit point. So if I turn snapping on, there's a lead indicator to highlight it there. There it is there. Now as I scroll along, it'll stop and pause for a moment on markers, and it'll also pause on edit points. So it'll pause for a certain number of degrees of rotation of the search dial. That's how that works. Now, I can also insert new clips and keep the transitions with the speed editor as well. So if I go to the source tape and I go along and look for a new clip, so I want to get a bit of that. When I go and do a smart insert, it'll include the transition that was at that in point when I put the clip in, so that's really nice too. Now there's other edit modes in the keyboard that are much smarter because they're designed to work with the keyboard. Like the place on top, for example, places a clip on top of the current layer in the timeline. Ripple overwrite will replace the clip in the timeline, and if the new clip is a different length, it'll basically just accommodate it. So if it's shorter or longer, it'll basically change the space and swap out a clip. The close-up function is really smart. It uses some image recognition to do close-ups of people when they're talking. And it also now in Davinci Resolve 17 copies the color grade. So when you do a close-up of a shot, if it's got a color grade on it, it'll copy the color grade to the close-up clip. But one of the most unique edit modes is actually called source overwrite. It's extremely powerful for cutaways. So what I'll do is I'll do a quick multicam project and you can see really how that works. So I'll go back over here and create a new project. So I'll go over here, go new project. I'll create a new timeline. I'll also bring in our multicam media, which is our cooking show stuff. Now I'll come back to the speed editor and I can click source tape. I can find my wide shot. Now what I want to do is lay down a base layer from the wide shot. So I'll scroll along and have a look. Oh, there it is. So I'll go, well, actually I can just push the append button and it'll drop that whole clip down into the timeline. So there it is there. Now what I want to do is I want to create some cutaways. Now the first thing I'll do is I'll set it to video only because once I've got my base layer, I've also got my audio track. Now what I want to do is find some video cutaways and drop them in. This is where it shows you what the source overwrite function really does. It's very powerful. So let's go back to my source tape. Let's look along and find, oh, I've got some nice shots there. Well, actually, let's get the shots here where they're using the, they're cutting things. Let's have a look at that. So she's cutting something here. So if I go and create an in point on that and an out point, I can show you how the source overwrite function works. So now I've got that shot. Now the great thing about source overwrite, it'll place the shot in the timeline on the layer above, synchronized to that base layer, because this is a different camera view. So let's go and push source overwrite, and there it is there. Now if I go to the timeline and have a look at that, I'll see that cuts away nicely. So, and that's all synchronized. So you don't need to care about what you're doing. You can pretty much just run along looking for good cutaways. Anytime you find anything, you can drop another cutaway. So let's find another cutaway. There she's doing something there. Well, let's find a different, we'll go to a different camera actually. Oh, the wok, this will be good. Yeah, there's some good stuff here. Let's find, oh, that's good. That bit there, let's have a look at that. We'll put an in point. Out point, source overwrite. Let's look for something else. While she's putting in the ingredients. In, out, source overwrite. So I can just pretty much go along and add in cutaways, and there's all my shots, and, and they're just laid on top, and you see they're perfect cutaways. Now that's great. You can just run along looking at all your camera sources, find different cutaways and drop them in, and they'll synchronize to the timeline for you. So it's very fast to use, but the problem is, what happens if you have multiple cutaways? This is where it gets really exciting, and this is what the sync bin is for. So the button up here for the sync bin, if I press that, what it does is it goes off and gets all my synced angles that synchronize to this point in the timeline and shows you all those angles at the same time. So you can see them all there. And I've got 6 different angles. So as I scroll along the timeline, I've got a bunch of different views and I can work out what to do. Now this is kind of the reverse of looking at cutaways. Because before what we did is we added, we found a shot and added it to the timeline using the source overwrite. The question, of course, is which cutaway? The sync bin shows us all the camera angles all at the same time. It tracks when we scroll along the timeline, so you can see what all the different angles are. And it means it does all the work for you. It's kind of like having an assistant editor that goes off and gets things. And this panel is really, really good for using the sync bin. So let's have a look at a shot number and we'll go and find something else to add in. There's a good bit there where she's using camera 2. So we'll push camera 2. And you see it's automatically selected in and out point for us. Now we can trim that out point, so we can give a little bit more. I can even trim the in point back a little bit while she's stirring, and I can go and add that source overwrite. Then I can go along and see what else we've got. There's a bit where she's putting something in the wok there. So we can go camera 1. I can trim the out of that. And I can do a source override on that. So that's all pretty good. So that's all there is to it. You just go along and you can find which source is the best source and you can add that in. Now, one thing worth noting, if you've selected one of the camera numbers, say you camera number 2 and you don't want to select that, there's an escape key up on the keyboard here so you can push that. And in fact, if you double push escape, it does undo. But if you push escape, you come out of the camera. If you push a camera number, you go into the camera. Push escape, you come back out of the camera. So if you don't like the camera, you've selected, I don't want that one, just push escape and you come back out of it. Now that's really fast, but there's an even easier way of doing that than this. So let's have a look, and it's called live overwrite. So if we scroll down the timeline a bit to where there's some action, I think there's a bit where she's plating up. So have a look where that is. Yeah, that's the bit down there. There's a bunch of stuff happening here. So let's have a look here. Now what we can do is we really like camera number 1 here. So if I hold camera number 1 and scroll along, it'll now live overwrite that into the timeline. I can scroll along until she's moved away from something else, and then she puts the plate down on camera 2. So I want to go to camera 2. So I can drop camera 2 down. That looks good. I can go back to the wide shot, bit of that. And then I really like camera 3. That looks pretty good. You can see putting something in camera 3. So you can hold that down. There it is there. So you can see how powerful live override is. It basically just paints the shot into the timeline automatically. And you can see how easy it is to do a bunch of cutaways. But it's really quite easy to bump the jog knob. When you release, it'll finish on the out point. But the jog knob's a little bit sensitive, and so I'll turn off snapping. So you can bump it a little bit. Sometimes you can put jump cuts in, like little gaps in the timeline. So the speed editor has a dedicated live overwrite button. So what that means is it transforms the keyboard into a bit like a switcher. So if I turn live overwrite on, it acts a bit like a switcher. So the camera number buttons are lit up. So for example, which camera number do I like? Say I like camera number 1. So now when I scroll along, it'll scroll along, and undo is scrolling backwards. So I scroll along, and I kind of like camera 4. Now I push camera 4. I scroll along. Oh, actually, I'm going to go back and change that because I quite like camera 2. There's camera 2. And there's a bit on camera 6. Looks quite interesting, so I can scroll along. Basically, I'm just switching across and scrolling along, adding clips. So it's as simple as that, is scroll along and add clips. Now the transition type is indicated on the bottom here, and I've been doing cuts, but I can push dissolve, and now what it'll do is it'll transform into dissolves. I can also push the transition button up here. So what I can do now is when I scroll along, everything will be a dissolve. So if I scroll along and go to 6, oops, sorry, I want to go to 4, it'll do a dissolve to 4. And that'll be the default transition. Go back to 6. Oh, go to 3, I like 3 there. And everything's now a dissolve. So that's pretty cool. Instead of selecting just dissolves, I can also select transitions from the transition palette there. And then when I select a shot, I'll go to camera 1. Then I'll add those transitions, and they're different again. Back to camera 3, and maybe camera 2, and so on. And then if I go back to the timeline, now I've got all my cutaways, and I've got the manual transition. And I can, of course, change that transition just by holding down the transition palette. I might want to change to a ripple wipe. So you can still do all the trimming that you'd like to do. I can roll the edit. If I don't like the edit points, I can do all that. So I can scroll along, and there's my edit. So you can see how fast that is. Now, what's really funny about this is that if that's not even fast enough, let's go back a little bit, and I'll show you something we added as a bit of fun. So I'll go back to this point here. I'll go back into the sync bin, and I'll turn the live overwrite function back on. Now, we thought it'd be really funny is if a lot of times when you're editing, say a music video or something like that, it doesn't really matter what camera you cut to, and really quite on the duration that you are either. So we thought it'd be funny to create a random function. So if you push the live overwrite button twice, it's got the word random on the front. It'll just pick a camera source and of a roughly random duration and just put it down. And if you keep doing it, it'll keep placing transitions. I can push dissolve and it'll do them with dissolves. And now, this is not really the best media for it. But if I go back to the timeline, now I've got pretty much a random edit. Oops, go back to the timeline. And I've got this sort of random edit that if that was a music video or something, that can be a lot of fun. And you can, you know, sometimes it works quite well. But again, you can go in and trim if you need to trim. So I've really only shown you, editing shots from a single camera, and I've shown you some multicam editing, but you can really see how much faster this is. So we think the speed editor is going to be really exciting.